thank you all for joining us today. I think there'll be a few folks joining along the way here, but let's get started. My name is Terry Tamminen. I'm the president and CEO of Altus Sea in the Port of Los Angeles. Those of you in Sacramento may remember me from my days in Sacramento as the Cal EPA secretary. Proud that my picture still hangs in the lobby, so I'll wave at you as you come through. But anyway, very excited today to have a great group to discuss carbon dioxide removal, especially ocean carbon dioxide removal. And let me also just quickly introduce our team. Jade Clemens, who is the director of our Blue Sustainable Economic Alliance program. Jade will wave right there, and she'll be taking over in a moment here. Our senior manager for communications, Alex Cornejo. Alex, there's Alex. And our colleague from Seventh Generation Advisors, who helps us with these programs and is the program director at Seventh Generation Advisors, Jenna Cittadino. And there she is. So thank you all for helping us put this together. Today, we're going to hear some opening remarks from Assembly Member Pappen, and then we'll get right into a panel discussion with some really outstanding experts on carbon dioxide removal, the whole topic in general, but particularly from the ocean, and get into a panel discussion, but then Q&A from you in the entire group here. Let me just ask you to please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And if you do have comments or don't have time to be able to contribute when we get to the Q&A, feel free to put things in the chat. We are recording, so just so everyone knows we're recording this, we'll make this recording available to others who couldn't participate this morning, but also that way we'll have the chat saved and can get back to folks as needed. So with that, let me introduce Assembly Member Diane Pappen, who represents the 21st District, which includes the entire Bayside, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Assembly Member, but San Mateo County from Brisbane to East Palo Alto. And you are also the chair of the Assembly Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife, very important responsibility. And prior to your joining the Assembly, I believe you served as the mayor and a city council member for the city of San Mateo. And you were recognized there as a regional leader in championing the investment in infrastructure and climate adaptation, which is sadly increasingly important. We can't just mitigate our way out of the climate crisis. We will have to adapt. And I know you've been a long champion for infrastructure that is resilient to a changing climate. And of course, as a member of our state assembly, we know you're invested, very, very focused on investments in those strategies to address climate change and the very related challenges of flooding, drought, wildfires, and water quality. So without any further ado, Assemblymember Pappen, may I turn it over to you for some opening remarks?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. I'm just so grateful to Altus Sea for arranging this webinar to discuss carbon management in our oceans.
All right, well, we seem to have lost a few, including Assemblymember Pappen, who we knew only had a few minutes anyway. But let's get started. I suspect a couple of others will come back in as they realize that we are restarting. So again, we'll ask everyone to stay on mute if they're not speaking, obviously not screen share without permission. And again, a reminder that we are recording so we can at least share the valuable information with those who either got booted out or couldn't attend today. So this will still be a very useful webinar. And with that, I want to turn it over to our director of our Blue Sea program, Jade Clemens.
Hi, everyone. Again, thanks for bearing with us today. And I'm still very excited for this conversation. Let me briefly introduce the panelists that we have joining us. We have Sophie Chu, Principal Oceanographer and Director of MRV at Captura. We have Alicia Karspeck, the Chief Technology Officer of Seaworthy, Brad Ack, the Chief Executive Officer of Ocean Visions, and Madeline Harden, a researcher at the USC Sergei Nuzhdin Lab. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation, and we'll still provide some time at the end here for questions from the audience as well. If you have any burning questions, we'll try and make sure we save time to get to them. So first of all, when we speak of carbon management, we're talking about a few different methods and processes. So we're talking about carbon removal, carbon capture, carbon sequestration and storage. So I think maybe some table setting is in order. Brad, in particular, I'd like to ask you if you could briefly explain the differences between carbon removal, carbon capture, and then what we mean by carbon sequestration or carbon storage.
Sure. Thanks. And hello, everybody. There is a lot of confusion about this whole issue that maybe broadly comes under the realm of carbon management. And I think to make it easier, there are sort of two big things that we can do to deal with carbon pollution. One is we can prevent it from going into the atmosphere, and the other is we can remove it from the atmosphere. Those are the two, that's the binary approach. So anything that is preventing it from going into the atmosphere typically comes under the banner of carbon capture. Now, unfortunately, some people will use those words for removal as well, but really to make it clean, if it's on top of a smokestack, at the end of a tailpipe, if it's stopping carbon from getting in the atmosphere, we consider that carbon capture. If we are cleaning it up from the broad environment, that is carbon removal. And so they are, one is pollution prevention, one is pollution cleanup. In the case of carbon removal, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do it. And that includes terrestrial approaches and marine-based approaches. We're here to talk about marine-based approaches, obviously. And then in either case, once you have the carbon, you have to do something with it, and that's sequestration, right? So no matter whether it's preventing the pollution, capturing it at the source, or capturing it from the environment, cleaning it up from the environment, you then have to do something with it. And there are a bunch of different forms of sequestration. The most commonly understood is in geological formations, where you can essentially mineralize the carbon back to rock. That's not the only way to do it. People are putting it in cement. People are putting it in long-life plastics. People are thinking about how it can be stored in the bottom of the sea, where we already have a very large reservoir of carbon. So hopefully that clears up a little bit some of the terminology.
Hopefully, it certainly even helps clarify some things for me, even though I've been reading and learning about this for quite some time. Alicia, I'd like to turn to you for some table setting as well. I'm hopeful that you can explain what we mean by both MCDR, so marine carbon dioxide removal, and then MRV. You get both of the M acronyms and how they're related.
Great. Hello, nice to see everybody here, and thanks Jade and Terry for the invitation to be here. Let me just start out, with some level setting around what we mean by marine carbon dioxide removal and then MRV. And there's a lot of acronyms that come up in the carbon dioxide removal space. So we'll try to use as few acronyms as possible. When you hear things like ocean CDR, so ocean carbon dioxide removal, or MCDR, which stands for marine carbon dioxide removal, these are synonyms. So you can use either one the same. And basically they refer to a broad class of pathways. Pathways is a term that we use to describe different mechanisms for doing carbon dioxide removal. It's a broad class of pathways that in some ways utilize the ocean's natural system and natural capacity to take up carbon from the atmosphere in order to actually purposely remove that carbon. So let me give you a couple of examples of what some of those pathways might be. We typically think of there being sort of two, again, classes of those pathways within the ocean, approaches that we call the biotic approaches. So biotic basically means biology. So this is kind of a class of methods that in some way uses plants and their natural process of photosynthesis to actually remove that carbon from the atmosphere. I won't go into too much detail about that pathway. They're quite complex, actually, and Madeline might talk a little bit about that. And then there's a type that's called abiotic approaches, so abiotic, so not biotic approaches, which basically rely on the carbonate chemistry part of the ocean. These are called things like ocean alkalinity enhancement, where you're adding alkaline materials to the ocean, or direct ocean removal, where you're stripping CO2 out of the ocean. And these are mechanisms which, again, are relying mostly on the natural processes of the ocean and just accelerating and leveraging those processes. Again, whole discussions we could have about each of those pathways, but I'll kind of stop there and talk a bit about what MRV stands for. So another acronym. Let me go piece by piece. It stands for measuring or monitoring, reporting, that's the R, and verification. So what the measuring and monitoring piece of this, you can think of this as the process of quantification. So it's this process of trying to actually, either through measurements, or through modeling techniques actually tell how much carbon you're removing from the ocean in this carbon dioxide removal pathway. So if there's a particular deployment, there needs to be potentially some sensors or some models that are out there that are actually telling you something about the amount of carbon that's being taken up. That's the M. The V, that's the third piece of that acronym, is verification. So verification is this process where you have potentially a third party, so someone who's not actually doing the deployment, coming in and making sure that what you're reporting that you've done is actually what has been done, and that you're following the best available science and standards in terms of how you're doing that measurement or monitoring process. And this middle acronym, reporting, broadly speaks to this issue of actually needing to register some of these carbon dioxide removals in some sort of company that is potentially called a registry. And we have this term within carbon dioxide removal markets called registry, which is a place where you basically put the information that says, this is the amount of carbon that I'm saying I'm removed. And now it's part of a sort of public registry for saying, yes, that is, we all collectively agree that that is on the record for the amount of carbon that's removed. So that's the MRV. I'll say one quick question about why that's so important. And there's two main reasons I think important for this audience to think, why do we care about monitoring, reporting, and verification? The first one is to remember that carbon markets, and these are sort of the voluntary carbon markets where you can basically trade money for carbon credits on the voluntary markets. Those, we really need a method for making sure that they represent real removals of carbon from the atmosphere. So MRV is how we make sure that represent real removals of carbon. So it's important from a marketplace dynamics. And it's also important just as we think about ourselves as stewards of the climate, which is that we actually want to make sure that we are, globally speaking, drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. So two reasons why we really care about that quantification and reporting and verification step.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And yeah, you've queued up my next question perfectly here. I'd like to turn to you, Sophie, to elaborate a bit more on kind of the natural ocean chemistry for the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because again, Alicia already touched on there are these pathways that are already sort of naturally occurring by which the ocean ends up sort of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and sequestering it. And then, yes, Madeline, I'd love to turn to you after Sophie to chat more about those biotic approaches that Alicia spoke to. So Sophie, can I turn to you first to just generally describe kind of how the ocean naturally is absorbing carbon from the atmosphere?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Hi, everyone. So oceans cover 70% of the surface area of the Earth. And that interface where the air, sea touch is where gases exchange back and forth, depending on the concentration of the gas in either the atmosphere or the ocean. And so since the Industrial Revolution, we've been, releasing a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. About half of that has stayed in the atmosphere and increased the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And then that has led to the ocean taking up or absorbing some CO2 into the ocean, about a third since the Industrial Revolution. That has increased the CO2 as well in the ocean. So the ocean has kind of been keeping up with this increase in CO2 that we've been releasing into the atmosphere.
Thank you, Sophie. And then, so Madeline, I'd love to turn to you to speak to beyond, again, just the ocean chemistry, there's all of this ocean life, right? That is also helping to, or not helping, but just simply does absorb carbon. If you could speak to some of those biotic approaches that Alicia was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. So when we talk about plant life in the ocean, we can think about it broadly as phytoplankton, seaweeds, which are protists and not true vascular plants, and then sea grasses, which are rooted vascular organisms. So phytoplankton, I believe this might be incorrect, but they account for the highest amount of biomass in our oceans. So they are globally distributed. They're usually at that upper layer of the ocean, and they absorb carbon dioxide via photosynthesis. So as Sophie was just talking about, with that carbon sequestration in our ocean environments, phytoplankton, this huge amount of biomass, some which are only single-celled organisms, will photosynthesize, they'll take in carbon dioxide, and they'll produce oxygen as the byproduct. But that carbon dioxide stays within their cells, And when those phytoplankton die, they sink to parts of the ocean floor. And in some cases, they can sink deeper than others and be sequestered in the benthos or the bottom of the ocean, sometimes up to millennia. But as we are talking about in this conversation, the ocean, which is the carbon sink, has been heavily saturated with carbon up to this point. So it's really important that we're having conversations about carbon capture and carbon removal at the same time. So with phytoplankton, we're talking about something called the biological carbon pump, which is also seaweeds, such as giant kelp, which are native to Southern California, are protists, and they play a role also in this carbon pump. So they also photosynthesize. But the cool thing about kelp is that under ideal conditions, they are the fastest growing protists. So they can grow up to 3 feet in a single day. And they also capture carbon, and then it can become sequestered as they die and sink to the ocean floor. In a recent United Nations environmental report from 2023, it's the most comprehensive report on kelp forests globally. They reported that kelp forest ecosystems alone account for over 620 million tons of carbon dioxide sequestered annually. So they do play a really critical role. And then finally, I'll just talk really briefly about seagrasses. So when I say vascular, I mean they have root systems. So not only do they photosynthesize, they do the same thing as seaweeds and phytoplankton, but those roots also will help stabilize sediments and trap those sediments within their root systems. They play a little bit of a different role. Yeah, I think that just about covers it.
Yes, no, thank you for that. And I know we had sort of a prepared order here, but I'm going to jump around a little bit given the, the earlier disruptions and the way our conversation has flowed. I think this now actually might be a good time to also chat about some of the forms of technology that are being developed or already developed to help enhance these natural processes that are already existing. And so I'd love to turn actually back to you, Sophie, if I may, simply because Captura, of course, is developing and actually, again, already has developed one of these technological tools to enhance the ocean, some of these natural systems. So could you speak to the direct ocean capture method that Captura is using?
Yeah, sure. So it's really taking advantage or leveraging what the ocean is doing, what I just described that the ocean does naturally, which is absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. We are directly removing carbon dioxide from surface seawater, and then we're really only using renewable electricity and seawater as inputs, and then our outputs are this measurable stream of CO2 that we pull out, and then CO2 depleted seawater that we put back into the ocean. So that measurable stream of CO2 that we pull out can be either geologically sequestered, or it can be reused in low carbon products or fuels that can help with the decarbonization that we also really need to do in addition to removal. And so that CO2 depleted seawater that we discharge back into the ocean then has the capacity to take up CO2 from the atmosphere in that natural process that the ocean already, acts as a carbon sink.
No, thank you. And Brad, could I turn to you to maybe highlight a couple of the other most interesting, forms of MCDR technology that are being both used and explored right now? Oh, I think we need to make sure that Brad gets off mute. Oh, there we go.
Okay, yes. So I think Alicia or Sophie said it earlier, there's sort of two major, there's another binary split here in the ways the ocean can take up carbon. One is biotic, which Madeline just described some of those pathways, the biological pump, which also includes animals. And then abiotic, which is much more the chemically based approaches, geochemical approaches, which mirror natural processes of weatherization. And so within those two big domains, there are a number of pathways. In the biotic arena, anything that you can do to stimulate and increase the growth of phytoplankton or macroalgae, so micro or macroalgae, or other blue carbon ecosystems is going to fix carbon. And then the question is whether there's anything you can do, additional to what nature does to increase that amount of carbon that's either taken up or that makes it to the bottom of the sea. So I think Madeline described the fact that kelp naturally is sloughing parts of its plant material into the depths of the ocean, and that's creating a natural carbon removal and storage process. And so one of the pathways that people are looking at is, can we accelerate that? Can we capture and bundle kelp and move it quickly to the bottom of the sea so that all of that carbon could be stored, as an example? Can we grow kelp in places where it doesn't grow now? Such as in the open ocean on artificial substrates. Can we use diving platforms to access nutrients? There's a whole range of exploration of technology development going on around kelp. And the microalgae arena, there are, again, a number of ways. Many people have probably heard of ocean nutrient fertilization, which is often talked about as iron fertilization. But any way that you could stimulate additional blooms of phytoplankton that, again, would not naturally be occurring is a possible way to sequester carbon, presuming that some portion of that biomass makes it to the bottom of the sea, or that, again, you manipulate it by capturing the biomass and doing something with it. So there's a company, for example, growing microalgae inland in raceways. So removing it from the ocean where they can then dry it and bury it actually inland, right? So again, there's a whole range of possible ways that you can build on the power of nature and photosynthesis to increase the uptake of carbon and ultimately sequestration. And then in the abiological approaches, anything that increases the surface alkalinity of the ocean potentially can result in long-term storage of carbon through ocean carbonate processes, chemical processes, excuse me. And so once again, there's a whole bunch of different ways that people are looking at increasing alkalinity. Some, like Captura, are decarbonizing seawater using electrolysis and then putting that decarbonized water back into the ocean. And that's now its base. It doesn't have that acid in it. And so it is alkaline. That's one approach. Ebb Carbon, which was mentioned earlier, is doing something quite similar. Other people are using direct interaction of minerals, alkaline minerals, with seawater. There's a company called Vesta that is doing a pilot right now in Duck, North Carolina, on beaches, putting alkaline material on beaches to interact with waves and wash these alkaline ions into the ocean. There's even companies putting alkalinity into rivers and using the power of rivers to ultimately wash it into the oceans. And of course, enhanced rock weathering on land follows the same process ultimately. So I think, as Alicia pointed out, we call these pathways because there's a bunch of different ways that people are experimenting with to increase the ability of the ocean to remove and safely store carbon. However, we need a lot more of that. We need a lot more effort around all of the R&D necessary to fully flesh out, increase our knowledge of, and invent new approaches and pathways under these big domains.
Thank you, Brad. And yeah, well, building on that, then I'm going to jump back to Alicia. So one of the challenges here, right, is of course doing the research on each of these pathways, figuring out which are the most effective, safe, et cetera. And one of the challenges here is really figuring out the durability, if I'm not mistaken, of the storage and ultimate sequestration of carbon, and it varies across these pathways. Could you speak a little bit to just kind of really the challenges that are being faced when it comes to MRV, and then again, why we care when we're evaluating the durability of long-term carbon storage?
Yeah, thanks, Jade. And I just want to add something to what Brad said in response to what Jade said, which is one of the things that's really attractive about at least the abiotic methods and pathways for ocean carbon dioxide removal is that they are considered what's called durable. And so that's another word that gets thrown around a lot when we think about carbon and carbon removal, which has to do with carbon dioxide removal, which has to do with this idea of how long that the carbon dioxide is actually stored. So most people are familiar with what we call the conventional carbon dioxide removal pathways. These are things like managed forestries. They're usually on land, managed forestries, different agricultural practices. The vast majority of carbon dioxide removal that's happening around the globe right now is actually these land-based methods. One of the challenges with land-based methods is this question of durability. So how long does that carbon actually stay in the soil or in some of the plants and trees before it gets re-released? And so there's a question there about whether or not that's actually a durable long-term solution. You know, when we think about the oceanographic pathways, the community of people who thinks about this, the scientists, and there's a whole ecosystem of folks, happy to talk about that for a second, really thinks a lot about this question of durability, which means we want to make sure that the carbon dioxide that's removed through oceanographic pathways stays removed and out of the atmosphere for in excess of thousands of years. Again, so for each pathway we talk about, whether it's abiotic set or the biotic, we always think about this question of, is it durably removed? For the abiotic approaches, so the approach that Sophie talked about, ocean alkalinity enhancement, with which Brad talked about a little bit, these are considered durable, which means that we are storing the carbon storing the carbon away from the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. So I just want to make that picture people aware when we think about these ocean methods. That's a really key thing that we think about. It's also a key thing when we think about monitoring, reporting, and verification. So we are, of course, wanting to know how much carbon is removed, and we want to also ensure this issue with durability. So it's the MRV piece is a really important part of this ecosystem. It actually allows markets to take place. I want to just say something real quick about that kind of ecosystem of actors and where, for example, our organization fits in this ecosystem. And sorry, I'm using the ecosystem now to mean sort of a landscape of actors in the ocean carbon dioxide removal space. Each of us here is actually coming from a different sort of sector, right? We have private sector actors like Captura. These are typically startup companies who have started up in the last 4 or 5 years, who are really at the front lines of doing a lot of the innovation in terms of the technology and some of the early deployments. And a lot of the learning is really happening through the arm of these private companies. There are, of course, folks who are interested in purchasing the actual carbon credits that are developed by these companies. We call them the buyers. Those buyers right now tend to be what's called catalytic buyers. So these are usually large corporations or groups of corporations who have decided that they're going to make investments through purchasing and pre-purchasing carbon credits. So they are a really important part of this landscape right now because, again, they are the advanced buyers. The government is getting into this space, especially the Department of Energy, thinking about itself becoming an advanced buyer as a way to sort of catalyze research and innovation. In terms of academics, there are, of course, a lot of academic scientists who are both working at universities and also in federal labs. These are folks who are oceanographic scientists. They are oceanographers, they are biogeochemists. A lot of them are climate scientists who have been thinking about these things from a science perspective for decades and decades. And so, again, there is an entire world of folks on the science space who think about increasing our knowledge of the carbonate chemistry system, and that's important for understanding carbon dioxide removal. And then, of course, I don't want to forget groups like Brad Axe Group, which is Ocean Visions, and a group like Seaworthy. We're a bit unique. We are nonprofit organizations. There's a number of nonprofit organizations who operate in this space, who do a sequence of things around sort of building education and understanding of some of these processes, bringing in more money for research, or in the case of what we do at Seaworthy, really thinking about how we build some of these foundational tools that are needed by the industry and by researchers to do some of these quantification processes. So really wanted to highlight to folks, there's a lot of people working in this space, and it's really across sectors. And I think each of us has a slightly different perspective, but we all work very, very naturally together to move this space forward.
Thank you so much for Alicia. And I feel like for that, Alicia, I feel like the question that comes top of mind to me is, Okay, there's so many people, right, focused on this question of marine carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide removal generally. And why, right? Why isn't just decarbonizing the economy enough? Why can't we just focus on carbon capture? Why is it that we need to spend so much time and energy and resources on carbon removal? I certainly have my own answers to that, but particularly for those of you who have, you've put this, these are your careers. I would love to hear from you, maybe each in turn, if we don't mind. I think this might even be a good note to end on and then turn over to audience questions is, why is carbon removal so important generally, for all of us, but then also, if you want to speak to personally, why you have chosen to prioritize this work in your lives. And maybe Madeline, if I could I start with you?
Absolutely. So I think that one of the things that we touched on and what Alicia was just talking about is that this is a very much like a group effort. There's a huge cross section of people working towards a way to mitigate impacts to the climate, to our climate. And actually, I hadn't thought about this question until you just asked it just now, and it's so important because it's so incredibly important now that you asked this, because why is it not enough to simply have pollution mitigation mechanisms in place and to decarbonize our economy? Like, why is that not enough? The impacts to our ecosystems are happening so rapidly. And in a marine environment, which I'm most comfortable speaking about from my background and expertise, the damage is already done. We're already seeing such a steep decline in our ecosystem that those efforts that we talked about, those preliminary efforts, are simply not enough. If we don't have forms of carbon removal, carbon capture across the board, we will continue to see a rapid decrease in our healthy ecosystems. So it's a holistic effort from a broad array of industries and researchers and nonprofits. So yeah.
No, that was a fantastic off-the-cuff response, and sorry to put you on the spot. That was not the goal, but that was a fantastic response. Sophie, could I ask you to speak to the same issue?
Yeah, sure. I think the IPCC in the last few years released a report that said, even if we decarbonize like rapidly in the next 20, 30 years, there's still going to be emissions that we can't, that are being difficult to abate. So carbon dioxide removal is going to have to deal with that if we want to get to net zero, net negative emissions. And, I think recently also scientists have been saying that we can't actually make that 1.5 to 2 degree, limit the global warming to that level, even if we do all these decarbonization removal activities. But I mean, we need to do as much as we can, right? Like, we can't just be like, well, forget it. Like, so I think, that's kind of where there's going to be industries that we can't really reduce emissions on, that the removal is going to have to address, and historical emissions also, CDR carbon dioxide removal can address that as well.
Thanks, Sophie. Brad, I'll turn it to you next.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little more stark in my answer to this. We are way past a safe carbon budget right now. Anybody who uses the term "there's a carbon budget left," by definition is saying that the world as we know it now, with a devastating heat wave going on right now in India, following one that just happened in Southeast Asia, the potential loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the rapid melting of Greenland, the loss of coral reefs, all that's okay. If you say we have a carbon budget, that means that you're also saying that all of that is okay, because all of that is happening at 425 parts per million. If you don't think that's okay, and you'd like to see the planet come back, that's called climate restoration. It's an audacious goal, but at least it's one worth getting up for every day. And if you subscribe to that goal, carbon removal and carbon reduction are just two parts of the exact same path back to somewhere below 350 parts per million, which is what James Hansen famously told us a long time ago was the safe limit of carbon in the atmosphere. And I think he's been proven, and he and other climate scientists have been proven to be absolutely right. The world we live in now is dangerously unsafe for humans, and it's dangerously unsafe for nature. And carbon removal is the only thing, once you do peak emissions, is the only thing that brings you back. So it's not an either or, it's a yes and we have to do it quickly.
Thanks, Brad. Well, Alicia, that's a tough act to follow, but I have a feeling you're going to live up to the
I
challenge here.
got it. So I'll answer it ever so slightly. Variant of the question is, because I agree with everything that's been said about why CDR. And I would say another interesting question is why ocean-based CDR now? And you know, I think there's an important thing for the audience to realize is that, you know, when we think about the scale of carbon removal, we're talking about wanting to move in the next 10 years or so into around 10 gigatons of removal. Right now, we're at about 2 gigatons globally of removal annually. We want to move to 10. And again, most of that is land-based. And what experts know is that there is not a whole lot more potential for scaling up land-based carbon dioxide removal, which means there's this sort of gap. And that gap has to do with developing right now what we call novel methods of CDR. Novel, durable methods of CDR. The ocean-based CDR is a really promising version of novel, durable CDR. So types of CDR like the ocean-based methods are the ones that are actually going to get us to that final 10 gigatons, which is our target. And what's happening right now? So the question is, why right now? Is that this right now is really the pivotal decade for the oceans in terms of doing the research and development and doing some of the technology development to make sure that we can actually reach that potential for scale for ocean-based methods. So we really have to focus right now, not just on actually doing those removals, but actually setting in motion the research, the infrastructure, and the innovation that's needed to eventually use these methods to scale.
Thank you. And I mean, I have more questions, and I know we have a relatively small audience, but just in case, I do want to open it up to the audience. If there is anyone in the room still who would like to ask a question of any of these panelists, now is the time. Feel free to drop your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll get your question asked. And then I'll pause here for a little bit to allow anyone to ask the question. If not, I will jump into another question or two before we round out the session.
I'll jump in with one here. Again, this webinar was meant, and I know when we share the recording, since we lost some people because of the unfortunate interruption, but when we share the recording with those who were eager to get this information, I know the number one question they will ask is, what do you need from Sacramento? What can the state government do to facilitate your work?
Brad?
Yeah, I will. I'll just give you a few thoughts. Not being a California resident, but seeing California as one of the places that is often in the vanguard of innovation and creativity and new solutions to problems. It would be tremendous to see California take a leadership position on advancing the science and the testing of as many of the possible CDR techniques and pathways as possible, given the amazing oceanic resources that California has. Then there are just a huge number and all of the incredible talented scientific institutions and the robustness of the state agencies. It's a perfect place to be a laboratory, a living laboratory for a lot of these approaches. One of the biggest challenges to advancing CDR is finding places even to do the tests, because the regulatory environment is not conducive to testing CDR techniques. Unfortunately, we're really trying to slot carbon removal testing into regulatory pathways that were not created for this job. And so we're going to need to create some bespoke structures to allow this to happen in a test bed sort of way. We're going to need to create some places where there's pre-permitted testing that happens, where a number of different actors can work together. We need the power of the universities and the research institutions to monitor and verify. So there's just and of course, we need money, right? It's not cheap or easy to advance this kind of an enterprise.
Yeah, do any other panelists want to add to Brad's comments?
I could do an addition. So also not a resident of California, although I was actually born in Pasadena, so I love California. You know, one of the things, again, we are a nonprofit organization at Seaworthy, but the open source tools that we develop that help with part of this monitoring, reporting, and verification process, they're meant to really serve the emerging private sector, right? So it's really important actually for us at our organization that there is a thriving and healthy private sector that is resourced enough and has time enough and is present enough to actually use some of these tools. So I think a lot about the way that states can actually create these business environments that are welcoming and allow companies to thrive. It sounds like that's something that California's already been investing in, which is something that is really important. We certainly appreciate that. Of course, state governments can be pre-purchasers of credits. They're very powerful that way. They can think about this question of whether or not the state can look at whether or not they are ready to consider whether ocean-based carbon dioxide removal is something that they want to create as part of their purchasing portfolio. California is also in a really unique space because there is a compliance market in California, so a non-voluntary carbon market in California. It is a huge dream. I think at this point it's pretty far off that open systems approaches like Ocean CDR could one day be part of the compliance market. I think most people who are in the CDR space are hoping that we can move away from voluntary markets and into compliance markets. And California is certainly in a position to do leadership on that front.
Fantastic.
I might just add on your point, Brad, about essentially a test bed. That is something we're talking with ARPA-E about doing. They had an interest in this. They've got test beds for batteries and solar panels and every other kind of energy thing, nuclear power at various national labs, but nothing for the blue economy. So we're actually actively working with them on designing that. So the more specifics that any of you could provide us as to what you would want in that kind of a test bed, the better it will be as we kind of put that together and then seek funding both for whatever kind of equipment and academics for the MRV and et cetera, and the testing, but also to help hopefully support the companies coming in to be tested.
No, and that's a great example of how, you know, federal, state, and local policy needs to come together to support this work as well. Yeah. I know one idea that's also been floated is setting targets for carbon removal at the state level. I think, again, would be great if there is coordination across federal, state, local to make those targets achievable. Great. We have just a couple minutes here. Let me ask maybe one more time, see if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question. And if not, maybe Terry, I'll hand it back to you to send us off on a high note here.
Well, good. Again, I want to thank all of you for sticking with it. And I know we did have almost 40 participants before we were sadly interrupted. So believe me, this will be heard by everyone else at some point. And we'll summarize these notes for those who weren't able to participate or didn't have the time to sign up. And that way, even if they don't have time to listen to the whole webinar, we will be able to give them the key points and the key takeaways. We really appreciate all that you're doing. Look forward to helping you here at AltaSea. We'll keep in touch about legislative initiatives, but please also make sure you tell us what you need. Our goal as a nonprofit here is to accelerate climate solutions from the ocean at scale now. So anything we can do to do that together, we're all in. So thank you all so much for participating and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.